Hello and welcome to our program on cancer. Today we'll be talking about a disease that affects a lot of Americans. And with me to help me with this topic is Amber Bell.
Hello.
Amber, thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure, as usual.
Yes, and Amber is a doctor of science in physical therapy. We'll start today by talking a little bit about this disease. But Amber, what do you know about cancer?
I know a lot of people who have cancer. It seems like every time I talk to someone, they're mentioning a family member or a friend. It seems to be quite a problem that seems to be expanding over the last couple of years.
That's right. In fact, I was home at my home church, and I was listening to them ask for prayer, and they asked for prayer requests from the audience, from the congregation. And this is a congregation of like 30 people. And of those 30 people, 5 of them had requests for cancer.
There's got to be statistics out there about cancer rates in the U.S. You said 5 out of 30 just in your church alone were asking for requests. What do you know about what's going on in the rest of the country?
Well, it's interesting. We used to think of heart disease as being the biggest killer. Since 2005, cancer has surpassed heart disease as the #1 cause of death for Americans under the age of 85.
Wow. Now, when you went through medical school as a student, you must have come across many incidences of cancer.
Yes, you know, I remember one time they stood us all up and they started asking us questions. They brought in a patient and they said, "Dr. Clark, what do you think that patient has?" And I looked at the patient and they had a purple raised area on their leg. And I looked at that and I said, well, could it be Kaposi sarcoma? And they said, well, yeah, that's right.
Very
and
good.
then they had another question, though. Why do you think they have Kaposi sarcoma? Well, to me, this disease, Kaposi sarcoma, kind of a skin cancer or a blood vessel cancer, only comes when a person has AIDS, HIV positive.
An immune problem.
Yeah, their immune system is knocked out. And so I looked at it and I said, well, do they have HIV? And they said, no, but that's a good guess. They said what this patient has is a kidney transplant. And because they've had a kidney transplant from somebody else, they're dependent upon drugs to suppress their immune system so the immune system won't reject that kidney.
Right, so they had knocked out the immune system just like AIDS would have done.
That's right.
So obviously there's a connection between the immune system and cancer outbreak.
Isn't that interesting? The immune system goes down and pretty soon cancer starts to break out. And in fact, in patients with AIDS, they have a 2.5 times higher risk of all cancers. Kaposi sarcoma is 1,300 times more apt to happen in an AIDS patient.
Wow.
Yeah, lymphomas. This is a disease, a cancer of the blood, if you will, or of the lymph nodes.
Yep.
It is 135 times more apt to happen in an AIDS patient. And lung cancer can be 5 times more common. So it's definitely a case that when the immune system gets knocked out by AIDS, cancer increases.
Well, in her case, she didn't have AIDS, so apparently there's other things that can knock out your immune system.
Sugar may be the biggest culprit. In fact,
Interesting.
more and more we're finding people who eat too much sugar have a higher incidence of a lot of diseases. They did a study on people's white cells. You see, your white cells are supposed to knock out bacteria that would hurt you.
Okay.
And when a white cell is in good condition, one white cell can take out 14 bacteria in one day. But if a person takes 12 teaspoons of sugar, now what's a common food with 12 teaspoons of sugar?
Can of soda.
Can of soda pop. If a person drinks a soda pop, their white cell can only eat 5.5 bacteria.
So you're saying if I drink one soda today, I've cut my immune system ability to function in half.
Yeah.
Man,
Yeah, no more soda pop.
no more soda pop for me.
And if you drink 2 of them, your immune system's nearly totally wiped out. So, as you can see, it would be better not to be drinking sugary beverages.
Okay.
But what does that got to do with cancer? You know, hey, white cells eating bacteria. Cancer's not a bacteria, is it?
Well, tell me about
If
it.
you're on a high glycemic index diet, a diet high in refined carbohydrates, sugars and starches and so forth, that your risk of breast cancer goes up 40%, your risk of prostate cancer goes up 60%, your risk of colorectal cancer goes up 80%, Gastric cancer, 90%. We just keep going up the list here. Melanoma, 116%. Pancreatic cancer, 150%. And endometrial cancer is 170% increase from eating too much sugar.
Wow. And our American diet is just loaded with sugar. No wonder our rates are going up.
Yeah. You know how much sugar every American eats?
What do they eat a day?
About 32 teaspoons. And if you look at a year, they get about 125 pounds of sugar per year.
Well, that's pretty much, if you say 32 teaspoons, that's definitely cut the immune system out for the day. So if they do that all year long, you're functioning at a very low level then. No wonder we're all getting cancer.
Yes.
So you mentioned sugar is a big cause of suppressing your immune system. We talked about suppression of the immune system being a big part of the cause of cancer, like with AIDS patients. What else besides sugar is a cause for suppressing your immune system that might lead to being susceptible to cancer?
One of the things about sugar is that it's empty calories. It's malnutrition in a sense. People can get fat on it, but it isn't a good fat, it isn't a good nutrition, it isn't healthy.
So it doesn't give us any vitamins or minerals, you're
No
saying?
vitamins or minerals, that's right. People who are malnourished end up with an immune system that's compromised. They can look well and healthy, they can look overweight, but they can still have immune systems that are way down.
We tend to think of people who are extremely skinny or without weight as being malnourished, but in fact you're saying people who are overweight can be even more malnourished.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's true. And it's an unusual thing because in some societies, obesity is for the rich people.
Right, they can afford to buy as much meat and food as they want.
As much junk food as they
That's
like.
right.
That's right. And so they're in trouble. But the studies show that obesity itself is a big risk factor for cancer.
Well, you mentioned when you were in medical school about this lesion on the skin, this cancer lesion, and that you went along with AIDS. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
You know, the whole process there is kind of intriguing because, yes, AIDS is a virus, and the virus knocks out the immune system. But the Kaposi sarcoma is another virus. And they found that there are viruses that are associated with cancers. And so what happens, the immune system goes down, your immune system quits working, and then an opportunistic infection, something you didn't want, takes over.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it grabs you. And we could look at all the different associations, you know, hepatitis viruses, C and B with liver cancer, and papilloma viruses with cervical cancer, and leukemia viruses with leukemia and lymphoma. The list goes on of viruses that are causing people's cancer. We want to make sure that our immune system stays up so these cancer viruses
can't take effect.
Yeah, can't take over.
Now it's interesting that you should mention that. There must be some studies out there that show that coming in contact with these different viruses and problems show an increased risk of cancer. So there must be studies about carriers out there, different people who worked in different environments that are more susceptible to these viruses and how it's affected them?
Yes, and in fact there are. There are studies that show people who work in environments where there's more viruses catch more cancer. One of the biggest places this can happen is in the meat packing industry, or even in the supermarket where they're cutting meat. I found it interesting to find that people who are running their beefsteak through the bandsaw all the time can come up with more lung cancer because the blood's in the air, more leukemias, that's cancer of the blood, and lymphomas, that's cancer of the lymph nodes, just from being in an environment where all these viruses are. And so you wonder, well, what about the people eating that stuff?
It does make me wonder.
It's interesting that people who eat it get it more, but also, if you look at the meatpacking plants, people who work in the meatpacking plants where they slaughter the animals and they cut them up and they put them in packages so people like to buy it, they get more lung cancer, more mouth and throat cancer, more colon cancer, more bladder cancer, more kidney cancer. So it's definitely a case where the animal product, which is infected, can pass on the disease to the human being.
Now, if the animal product, what about products of the animal, like milk, for instance?
Cattle oftentimes have leukemia viruses and papilloma viruses. And so compared to normal tissue, cancerous breast tissue in people who have breast cancer has 3 times incidence of these bovine leukemia, that's cow leukemia viruses, and viruses that could be obtained from milk or from meat. So the connection there between human breast cancer and drinking milk is very strong.
Very high.
Yes.
Definitely. Well, tell me a little bit about the frequency of eating meat. I mean, say I only ate meat once a week or something like that. My obviously susceptibility to catching a virus is going to be a lot lower. Does that seem to pan out in the research?
Yes, and in fact, if you never eat meat, your risk of certain cancers such as ovarian, colon, and prostate cancer are pretty low. But if you end up eating meat more than once a week, just a little more than once a week, your risk of prostate cancer goes up 41%.
Wow.
Your risk of colon cancer goes up 85%. And the risk of ovarian cancer goes up 130%.
So increasing my intake of meat obviously increases my susceptibility to more viruses, and thus my incidence of cancer rate possibility goes up.
Yes, that's right. You know, even a good immune system, if it's overwhelmed by viruses from any source, can come down with the disease. So it's like, you know, if you didn't want to catch the flu, you wouldn't go where all the people have the flu.
Right.
Well, if you don't want cancer, you may not want to go where all the cancer viruses are either.
You know, a friend of mine recently, his father came down with prostate cancer.
Oh.
And he went to see a doctor, and the doctor said that, you know, dairy products and meat products can be the turn-on key for prostate cancer. Have you heard anything about that?
It's true. It's very true. And the studies show that red meat and dairy products eaten together will double the risk of metastatic prostate cancer. By metastatic, we mean not just prostate cancer. It just sits there. Sometimes everybody says, well, everybody gets prostate cancer before they die. Well, everybody doesn't get metastatic prostate cancer before they die. Metastatic prostate cancer is when the prostate cancer moves from the prostate to some other part of your body where you don't want it. Red meat alone will increase the risk of prostate cancer by 66%.
Wow.
And then there's certain meats that are especially bad. We call these the processed meats.
Okay.
You notice they don't take the best steak and process it.
Right.
This type of stuff they process isn't stuff you may want to eat anyway. Yes, the leftovers. And that will increase your risk of prostate cancer as well.
Okay. Well, if you mentioned milk and you've mentioned different types of meat, what about cheese?
Cheese, oh boy. You know, there's some people trying to make a case for cheese being good for you.
Well, everybody's always saying, you know, you need to get your calcium and eat lots of cheese, and you hear that on all the advertisements for kids' snacks. This has plenty of cheese where kids can get their calcium, you know.
Yeah.
So it is often advertised as a good thing.
I don't know that I would take all of my health hints from advertisements.
That's right.
Cheese has been shown to increase the risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, this is a type of blood cancer, by 66%, 2/3. So cheese is not necessarily a good food for fighting cancer.
Well, there's got to be some damage to the body when you're talking about eating these products and the viruses in your body. Does that affect your DNA, your body makeup?
Oh, it sure does, you know. And part of the thing that affects your DNA is the N-nitrosyl compounds, the nitrates they put on meat. You go to the supermarket and the meat is bright red. We think, well, bright red meat, that's great.
Good, right?
Looks good. Well, let me tell you, in real life, when you butcher the animal or when you do surgery on a person and you look at the muscles, they are not that bright red.
Right.
So you wonder, how they get that bright red in the supermarket? Oh, nitrates. And they do things to this food so they'll stay bright. So you can take a cow that's, 6 weeks old or 6 weeks dead and make it look brand new so people still buy it. And these compounds, when they go down the colon, come out the rectum, they cause DNA damage to the cells they pass by. And this DNA damage is the start of the cancer process.
So damages the cell, and that cell can produce cancer then, that damaged cell.
It sure can, yes. And then cancer can result from DNA messed up.
What if I cook my meat really, really well? Doesn't that kind of take out all the poisons and viruses and problems that I can find in the meat?
That's right. If you want to keep your meat from having viruses, mad cow disease, and trichina, you better cook it well done.
Isn't that what they say?
But when you cook it well done and it gets that brown color and it looks so like it's really cooked all the way through, what you've done is you just created a bunch more problems because it turns some of that protein into what's called heterocyclic amines. These heterocyclic amines are dangerous because these things go down your colon also and mess with the DNA. They cause problems that will result in cancer.
Well, you talked a little bit about what sugar does to the immune system. We talked about milk being a cause of bringing different viruses into your body. Tell me a little bit more about milk and the immune system.
Well, you know, milk is a special product produced by a cow for its own babies. We as human beings seem to be the only species that believes we need another animal's baby food our whole life.
Right.
And this baby food, cow's milk, is made to grow a little calf to a big calf in a very short amount of time. It'll also grow a little tumor to a very big tumor in a very short amount of time.
Yep.
In fact, in one study, tripling the amount of milk protein that you were eating could triple your cancer rate.
Tell me about how protein affects cancer.
This is an interesting thing because there's different sources of protein. You can get protein from animal sources or you can get protein from plants. And in fact, there is a difference. And the proteins that come from plants tend not to produce cancers quite like the protein that comes from animals.
Okay.
Animal protein will increase the risk of cancer. It'll increase the risk also of heart disease because it raises your cholesterol, believe it or not. But they did a study to compare how much protein an animal would need. They took a bunch of mice, because that's what we usually study, and they gave them two different diets. One was the usual protein diet, 25%, and the other was a 5% protein diet.
Okay.
And then they gave the mice something that would cause them to have cancer.
Okay.
Well, the mice on the low protein diet, they ended up not having the cancer grow much at all. But the mice on 25% protein diet had cancer growing, the tumors grew quickly, and not only did they grow quickly, but they also had those tumors moving to their livers and to their lungs.
So it caused it to metastasize throughout the body then?
Yes, it metastasized.
So you're saying cancer feeds off of protein, and the type of protein we get is very important, it sounds like.
Yes.
Well, what's a good source of protein?
Well, a good source of protein would be one that comes from a vegetable source. And why is that? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. It may not be just the protein that's doing this, but one of the reasons is that the protein you get from animals tends to have more proteins that create acid in the system. And an acidic system depresses the immune system and breeds cancer. That's right.
So we've talked a little bit about protein in cancer, milk in cancer. What about the growth factors I hear about that's in milk?
Well, if you're a dairyman, you want your cows to produce milk.
Right.
And in the old days, it was pretty hard to run a dairy if a cow only produced, a couple thousand pounds of milk every time it got pregnant. Nowadays, they can get a cow to produce 25,000 pounds of milk every time it gets pregnant. An interesting study came out where they were trying to prove that milk was good for your bones. A lot of these studies got sponsored when the original studies showing that milk was bad for your bones came out. And so one of these studies, they supposedly proved that milk was okay for your bones, but in the process of proving that, they let on that the milk had increased the insulin-like growth factor in the people drinking the milk quite a bit.
Okay.
And so we wondered, well, that's interesting. What does insulin-like growth factor do? And the studies show that insulin-like growth factor is linked to prostate cancer, breast cancer, and lung cancer. So drinking all this milk, yeah, it's trying to make a little calf grow big by producing more hormones in him. It'll produce more hormones in you too,
right.
And more cancer as well. And this insulin-like growth factor, when they look at breast cancer has a lot more receptors for this insulin-like growth factor than does regular breast tissue.
Well, that doesn't sound very good. Let's talk a little bit more about the roles of these hormones in breast cancer.
They don't think you can have breast cancer without hormones. It's pretty rare.
Okay.
And it's because the breast is made to respond to hormones for pregnancy and lactation, feeding babies, and so forth.
Right.
But this is a problem because these breasts are so sensitive to hormones. And so anything that increases your hormone levels over your lifetime will increase your risk of breast cancer. For example, early onset of menarche. Your period started very young.
Yep.
That can happen from drinking milk too with hormones. A late menopause. You had more years of susceptibility or exposure to, your own estrogens.
Yeah.
Hormone replacement therapy, taking, pills. And postmenopausal obesity. That's because fat cells actually produce some estrogen.
Yeah.
Yes. And then if you have an abortion where your body was preparing for a fetus, and then it had all this estrogen ready to go, and then the fetus was taken away, the estrogen then increases the risk of cancer.
Well, you can find this estrogen in a lot of meat, can't you? A lot of fleshy foods.
That's true. And if they give cows hormones, they can actually get 20% more beef out of a cow by giving him hormones on the same amount of feed. And one of these hormones, we'll just talk about one of them because it's hard to trace them all. They often give a cocktail of 3 of them, is estradiol. It's used as a growth promoter in animals, but it has been shown to cause tumors in rats and mice and hamsters and all these little creatures. And elevated levels actually increase breast and uterine cancer.
Well, it sounds like a cow. If I eat the meat, I'm going to get viruses that cause cancer. If I drink the milk, I'm going to get growth hormones, viruses, bacteria, and you name it, that is going to possibly cause cancer.
That's true.
If I breathe in the byproducts of working on the meat, I could probably get more cancer. So it sounds like overall, just this animal flesh food contact is not a good idea if I want to stay healthy.
That's right, Amber. Back a few years ago, Europe refused to take American beef.
I remember hearing about that.
Wasn't that something? They complained that our beef had, too much, hormones. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder how much hormones they do have. So I looked at the studies. How much hormones do American beef have? They were right. Let's just look for comparison. Let's take an example. If a woman is in her postmenopausal years, she likes her estrogen to be very low. But if that estrogen starts to go up, the risk of cancer goes up. In fact, if she has 9 units of estrogen in her whole body, 9 units, then her risk of cancer goes up 7 times. 7 times, that's a lot.
Wow.
But she'd like to keep it low. But let's just take 9 for example.
Okay.
If you looked at a European beefsteak, it would have 4.3 units of this estradiol. That means if she ate this European beefsteak, her body's estrogen would go up by 50%. But an American beefsteak had 20 units. This would make her estrogen in her body 3 times normal, or 3 times the high limit.
Right.
And so there's just we think, okay, well, so you're picking on beef. Well, hey, 1 liter of milk has 18. Wow, that's a lot. And if we want to talk about eggs, 2 eggs. 2 eggs,
Everybody has eggs for breakfast,
That's right. 2 eggs, 13 units. And so there again, she more than doubled the amount of estrogen in her body.
So if you're just eating 1 serving of steak or 2 eggs, you're increasing your rates or possibility of cancer by astronomical numbers. What other dietary areas can you get this estradiol?
Well, another area we have to think about is fat. We've talked about carbohydrates. Too refined gives you trouble. We've talked about protein, the sources and the amounts.
Yep.
But now we need to talk about fat. And it so happens that hormones are fat. They're a form of fat, like cholesterol.
Okay.
And so if you have these different types of fats and you're increasing the fats, then you tend to increase the other fats as well. And you increase the effect of those fats. And so a high-fat diet is associated with more estrogens in your blood and more androgens in the blood. That's male hormones in women.
Okay.
Just eating more fat.
Now, can we compare dietary fat and breast cancer?
We sure can. And there's a big study that came out a number of years ago showing the countries around the world how much fat they were taking in and what their breast cancer rates were. And we'll show this diagram for you here, but for example, Japan, they ate very little dietary fat and they had very low breast cancer death rates. But in the United States, we had very high intake of fat and a very high death rate from breast cancer.
Okay.
And you can see all the countries line up on the line. So I guess the message here is if you want to stay away from breast cancer, better stay away from fat.
You mentioned fat and breast cancer. What about male problems? Prostate cancer, does fat affect that as well?
We don't want to leave the men out either,
No,
do we?
that's right.
And in fact, a diet high in saturated fat triples the risk of dying from prostate cancer.
Well, we talked about dietary fat. There's many different types of fat that we hear about. Like, for instance, in New York, there was just a big hoorah on the news about them ordering or passing a law to take out trans fat of many of the products and the menus in the stores that are in New York. I think they pretty much ruled it out. Can you tell us a little bit about trans fat and its effects?
This fat is dangerous. It is implicated in diabetes, heart disease, but it's also been shown to increase breast cancer, prostate cancer, and colon cancer.
Wow. So it's a good idea that they've ruled it out then.
Yes, good luck though. Anytime you fry something, you make trans fat. So even if they put the best extra virgin olive oil into their vat to fry, in one or two fryings, it's going to be making trans fat.
Now you mentioned fat, body fat. You know, some people being obese more likely to have chances of cancer. Why is that?
Well, yes, we're making a little switch here, and we'll make that clear that we've been talking about dietary fat, and we mentioned obesity a little earlier, but when we start talking about body fat, there is a connection here. And what it is that when you have more fat cells, they are involved in hormone production. They produce more estrogens. And women who do not have estrogen have a very low risk of breast cancer.
Right.
While women who are obese and their cells are making extra estrogen have a much poorer prognosis if they get breast cancer. And this isn't limited, though, just to breast cancer. Obesity is a risk factor for cancers of the pancreas, the colon, the rectum, the prostate, the endometrium, the gallbladder. All these cancers, even cervical cancer and ovarian cancer, as well as breast cancer, are all increased by obesity.
Well, talk a little bit more about cholesterol.
We talk about cholesterol and heart disease.
Right, and cancer surpassing heart disease.
And cancer's now surpassing heart disease. What does cholesterol have to do with cancer? Well, cholesterol is the building block for most hormones. Most hormones are an alteration of cholesterol.
Okay.
And in fact, if people have elevated cholesterol and triglycerides, it significantly increases their risk of breast cancer. On the other hand, if they have more HDL, which is the high-density lipoprotein, the good cholesterol, and good vitamins like vitamin C and vitamin E, their risk of breast cancer goes down.
So not only do you want to avoid the estrogen or the chemicals that cause breast cancer, you want to not provide the building blocks for these hormones. Well, you mentioned a high-fat diet contributing to cancer, so there's got to be some studies out there about a low-fat diet taking away from your chance of cancer.
It's true, and there's one area that we haven't talked much about, and that is skin cancer. And the skin cancer is a part of the cancer picture that people don't think of much. About 1 million people will get skin cancer this year. And so they run out stores and they put on this fancy sunblock so that they won't get cancer.
Right.
Well, the sunblock makes it so they don't get vitamin D either. And vitamin D is very good at reducing cancer.
It helps boost your immune system.
It helps boost your immune system.
Right.
But if I can't get my sunlight, how am I going to get my vitamin D? So what's the answer? The answer is people on a low-fat diet have 1/3 the risk of skin cancer as those on a high-fat diet.
So skin cancer isn't necessarily a result of being in the sun, perhaps, but the effects of the sunlight on a high-fat content in your skin. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and the high cholesterol content in your skin.
Okay.
Yes. And so if you can lower your fat down to below 20%, your risk of skin cancer goes way down. You can go out and get your sun, and then you can get your vitamin D also.
Very good. Keep your immune system strong.
That's right.
You were mentioning postmenopause and hormones. I know a lot of people, especially in my practice, when we take their medication list down, that are on hormone replacements after menopause. How does that affect cancer rates?
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Everybody seems to be on estrogens.
Yes.
And the consequences, though, are real. For example, oral contraceptives increase breast cancer in a study of 37,000 women. Hormone replacement therapy, so you won't have hot flashes. Increases the risk of endometrial cancer by 45%. Well, then they say, well, you just take progesterone with it so you won't get the estrogen effect. Well, that increases breast cancer. And so there's no getting around it. Your body wasn't made to have you manipulate its hormones with pharmacological doses of hormones.
Well, chemicals.
Oh, chemicals.
Always in contact with chemicals around us.
Oh, and you know, back in the 1900s, when only about 3% of the population died of cancer, we didn't have near the number of chemicals in our environment that we have today. And there's many chemicals that are in our environment, in our houses, that have hormone-like effects, and they increase the risk of cancer. So let's give you an example. We've outlawed DDT, and it's byproduct DDD, but these were chemicals, which are still in our environment, by the way, still in fish. If you catch a fish, say up in Alaska, where the water is cold and there's lots of it, there's toxic levels of DDT in fish. They went up into the mountains in California, checked all the little lakes. There were toxic levels of DDT there too. We've pretty well polluted the environment with DDT. But the reason I mention DDT is that it has hormonal effects. It also increases free radical formation and oxidative stress. Well, what's that? What's free radical? Well, we have this whole concept in cancer about oxidative stress. We keep talking about that. It's become a buzzword. People are getting to know it because of that. But oxidation is when oxygen affects another chemical. And then that other chemical can go and oxidize something else. It's kind of like playing tag. Tag, you're it. And then you go and tag somebody else, and everybody gets oxidized then. Pretty soon, well, this oxidation can hit a DNA. The DNA gets oxidized, and it doesn't like to be oxidized. It goes crazy, and then you get cancer.
So basically, you're changing the DNA makeup, changing the cell, and that leads to cancer. And sources of oxidative stress
can be these chemicals, like DDT. It can also be anything that increases the inflammation in your body. Some of the reasons why these different fats cause cancer is because they increase the oxidative stress in the body.
Well, you mentioned DDT in fish. Where do they get it, and how does that affect me?
You know, these little lakes up in California that they were studying, they found out that these lakes had about 0.02 parts per million of DDT.
That doesn't sound like much.
No, it doesn't sound like much at all. But then they checked the plants. The plants had 5 parts per million. This means that these plants had concentrated it. We call it biomagnification. And people then say, well, maybe I shouldn't eat the plants. Well, good, but then the little fish came along and ate the plants. They tested the fish. The little fish had 300 parts per million.
Sounds like it's getting more and more concentrated as we go up the food chain here.
Yeah, up the food chain, or down the food chain, something. And then the big fish came along and ate the little fish, and it had 2,500 parts per million. Well, then the people came along and ate the big fish, and they didn't test the people.
Well, Dr. Clark, you mentioned, for instance, eating meat as it passes through your digestive tract, that it can affect the DNA, cause DNA breakdown. Can't your body repair DNA, or does it kind of accumulate over time, or how does that affect the breaking down of the DNA? Can you tell me a little bit more about that process in cancer?
Yes, the process is very insidious. And if you get one little DNA break, the body can fix that. But if you get 2 DNA breaks, the body has to work twice as hard. If you get 100 DNA breaks, it's a real problem. If you're always breaking the DNA with these heterocyclic amines, like with meat, then you end up with too many damaged DNA. And when the damaged DNA starts making protein, that's what it does, and it makes bad protein, gives bad signals to the cell, then pretty soon cancer can be produced. For example, lung cancer patients. They have a problem because the cigarettes make it so that their DNA does not repair as well. And so that's one of the reasons why, you know, smoking is such a carcinogen.
Okay. Well, you mentioned tobacco. What about my morning coffee?
Yeah, the caffeine is a problem because not only does the caffeine increase the risk of cancer, it stops the DNA damage from being repaired. For example, 2 or more cups of coffee per day more than doubles the risk of ovarian cancer. And it also increases the risk of breast cancer when you have a high-fat diet.
Well, whenever anybody mentions cancer, I mean, it's been in the news for many, many years, cancer caused by tobacco.
Yes.
And lung cancer is the #1 that we always usually hear about.
We usually think about lung cancer, don't we? And you might think that that's where it stops. But in fact, it also can cause cancer of the lip and mouth. Well, that seems pretty logical because they're holding it up to their mouth, throat and voice box and trachea. But it can also cause stomach cancer, liver cancer, pancreas cancer, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, cervical cancer. Seems like the list goes on and on. But it's a very insidious carcinogen. Leukemia, which is blood cancer, colon cancer, skin cancer, all these different cancers can come about just because a person is taking this tobacco into the system.
So we've mentioned tobacco, we've mentioned, sugar in the past, caffeine. What about alcohol?
Yeah, alcohol. Recent studies have come out and shown that alcohol actually reduces the risk of heart disease.
Let's drink.
Yeah, everybody then starts drinking. I had one patient came in and said, I never used to drink, but they told me I had to drink because it would help my heart. And it's kind of like, the bomb that hit Hiroshima reduced heart disease almost 100%.
Right.
It's like, now, nobody ever said that alcohol was heart disease producing, or that was the problem with alcohol. Now, when we're talking about cancer, we find out that there's about 60,000 excess deaths per year related to alcohol alone, not to domestic violence, not to excess motor vehicle accidents. This is cancer deaths linked to alcohol. Yeah, and these cancers include esophageal cancers, cancers of the mouth and larynx, and liver cancers, of course, from liver disease. And then there's also risk of colon cancer, rectal cancer, breast cancer. And breast cancer is actually a big one for alcohol. So when they told you it was good for your heart, they didn't tell you that not far from your heart was your breast, and the breast wasn't going to do too well.
Right. So it sounds like there might be some little product in it that is good for you, but the majority of it is not.
And in fact, that little part that is good for you, you can get from the grape juice the same phytochemicals that will help your heart without the entropy, the alcohol, that will hurt other parts of your body.
So go straight to the source, eat grapes.
Eat grapes, that would be the best.
Okay.
That's right.
It's funny, just talking about all this stuff, you think about your own concept of what health is. And many of us think, well, health is weighing a certain amount.
Yes.
Or health is looking a certain way.
Yes.
But you don't realize sometimes the things that you're taking into your body, the effects on the inside, because you can't always see it. Like, for instance, I saw an article once where this guy's face had kind of ulcers all over it, and it said, if your liver looked like this,
oh, interesting.
would you keep eating this way or drinking this way? Because you can't always see the effects right away. So it's interesting that you're mentioning, the effects of DNA, because you think DNA, well, what is that? Just, you can't even see it, this little tiny thing inside of me, and you don't realize the extent of which it can disrupt your body with, like you're talking about caffeine, alcohol, food additives, all these little things that you cannot tell, but later on in life, will affect your body as it accumulates, and like you're talking about, so much accumulation, and if you eat all of these things, think what you're doing to your DNA.
Oh, yeah, it's accumulative.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, we've talked about what we eat. How about how often we eat? Does that affect our body, our immune system, our DNA, that sort of thing, our cancer?
Yeah, meal frequency is a big deal. We think of people who start out the day and eat breakfast.
Yep.
They go to work, and then between breakfast and lunch, they have a snack, coffee and donuts or some other food.
Right.
And then they get to lunchtime, and they eat a big lunch. Then halfway through the afternoon, you might think, oh, maybe they eat something healthy like carrot sticks and celery. Well, then they come to the night, and then they eat a big meal. Well, they've just eaten 5 meals. Studies show that people who eat twice a day, only 2 meals, where you're used to eating 3, but just people who eat 2 meals a day, have 70% less cancer than those who eat 3 meals a day. And if people eat more than 3 meals a day, say 4 meals a day, the risk of cancer goes up 90% for the colon. So it makes a big difference, and you wonder why that is.
Right.
And maybe it's because they're eating things that have more toxins in them, but I think it's also you're overworking the system. System needs a chance to rest and recuperate, to repair some DNA. And if you keep eating, that won't happen.
Yeah, definitely want to avoid that. I know that many people are trained that way, like who go to nutritionists or trainers, personal trainers will say eat more meals a day because it keeps your metabolism, like I was saying, at a certain level. But in reality, I think it just hurts your body because, like you said, it needs rest. And the other thing I hear a lot of people say is, well, I get hungry an hour after I eat. You know, a big thing about that is just eating all the refined foods spikes your blood sugar for an hour, and then that drops and you feel hungry again, whereas eating lots of grains and fruits and vegetables keeps your blood sugar at a normal level, so you don't feel that hunger within an hour or two of eating.
Yeah.
So just something to think about.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So we talked about food additives and causing DNA breakdown.
That's right. You look at the ingredients list. It can go on and on and on. I think the best advice is just eat as close as you can to the garden. And if you have your own garden,
all the better.
All the better.
You know exactly what's coming from.
That's right. That's for sure.
Well, what about our work environment, the time where we spend our time? We talked a little bit about chemicals like DDT. What about our work environment?
There was one study where they took a bunch of people and they tested their blood to see how good their immune system was.
Okay.
And then they remodeled the office. This was like 25, 30 people. And they put in new carpet and new linoleum, and they put new upholstered chairs and, you know, plastic desks, and painted the walls and, you know, new ceiling tile. When they got done, it was a nice looking office. But then, in 6 months, they tested the people's blood again. They all had high levels of chloroform and acetaldehyde and formaldehyde, and their immune systems were way down. And so, in our environments, these chemicals can be very dangerous. And this is a big problem for people. Some people have to work with a lot of petroleum products. I mean, you have truckers that drive trucks, and you have people that work on railroads and the big diesel railroad engines. And in fact, one study showed that railroad workers exposed to diesel fumes have a 40% increased incidence of mortality from lung cancer.
Wow. What about plastics?
Oh, plastics, you know. Do you store any of your food in plastics?
On occasion, I do.
Oh, you know, it's hard to avoid. In the old days, they used maybe glass or something like that, but boy, we've become the plastic society. We get our peanut butter in plastics and the applesauce and bottled water, and people get pop and milk in plastic, and then all the plastic, you know, wrapper things, the shrink-wrapped foods and foods that hang on the wall in plastic display cases. And
it's all around you.
It's all around you. You can't hardly avoid it. And in fact, they did a study on people who work in plastic factories. They had 5 times the risk of pancreatic cancer and liver cancer.
Interesting.
So, you know, the liver is what filters out a lot of the toxins out of your body. And it's interesting because we don't sweat as much these days. People don't work that hard. We tend to put more stress on other parts of our body to get rid of toxins. And the liver is one of these.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned pancreatic cancer, just as being part of chlorine. Anything else that might increase the risk of pancreatic cancer?
Yes. When I was a medical student, I did research on pancreatic cancer.
Okay.
I was looking up records of patients that had been at the hospital where I was training for the last 5 years.
Okay.
There was a couple hundred pancreatic cancer patients. None of them were still alive.
Interesting.
All of them had gone through painful surgeries or chemotherapy or radiation, all kinds of things, before they actually died. Most of them died within 6 months of getting their diagnosis of cancer. So what increases the risk of pancreatic cancer? Number 1 is salt.
Salt.
High salt diet. Yep, smoked meat, fried foods, refined sugar. We already spoke about that. Coffee will do it. and being too heavy, we mentioned that, but one that we need to mention especially is food with preservatives or additives. And this is a big problem because a lot of foods have preservatives and additives. Now, just for a relative, how much increase in risk you have from getting foods with lots of preservatives and additives, fried foods and smoked meat and salt and refined sugar, together increase the risk maybe 4 times.
Oh.
The food additives increase it about 12 times.
Just alone?
Just alone.
Interesting.
Yeah, so this is a big deal here. And so how to avoid that, huh?
Lots of fruits and vegetables.
Lots
no
of
ingredients.
Fruits and vegetables. That's correct.
Cancer. We've just been talking about so many causes. It's almost overwhelming sometimes when you think about, man, I can't, I have to stay away from food additives. I have to stay away from refined foods, sugars, salt. It just seems like everything out there can be contributed to cancer. But I think we're going to talk a little bit about this on what I can eat and what I can do in a little bit. But just more on that cancer topic, the esophagus.
Oh, yes.
Let's talk about special things that can affect my ability to consume what I enjoy eating.
Yes, the esophagus. It is a good model for another aspect of cancer, and that is this. If you burn your esophagus, foods you eat, reflux, where food's coming up from your stomach, anything that keeps burning the esophagus, makes it so the esophagus has to keep healing.
Right.
We have this disease we call Barrett's esophagus. It comes from too much reflux, and people complain of their reflux a lot. What happens is in the Barrett's esophagus, the esophagus gets burned. Once it gets burned, it starts healing. It gets burned again, it heals some more. It gets burned again, it heals some more. Well, pretty soon it loses the ability to stop healing. And it just keeps healing, and these healing cells go somewhere else in the body and start healing, and we call it metastatic cancer.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about certain chemicals and hormones in your body that can contribute to cancer. We've got to have something in us that fights it.
Oh, yes. Yes. One of the hormones in your body that helps fight cancer is called melatonin. Melatonin is produced in the back of your brain, right where your eyes hook up.
Okay.
And since your eyes hook up there, if you have light coming in your eyes when it's not supposed to be coming in your eyes, like at night, then it suppresses your body's ability to produce melatonin.
So you produce melatonin then when you're sleeping?
You sure do.
Okay.
That's right. And if you get even a few minutes of light, bright light at night, it can stop the body's ability to produce that melatonin.
So don't turn the light on when I go to the bathroom.
That's right. The consequence is that people who work at night, do shift work, have higher rates of breast and colorectal cancer.
Well, what about stress? There's so much stress in our society.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone's worried about we're traveling somewhere, we're coming back from somewhere, we got a deadline with work, we've got deadline with the kids, we've got games here, games there. There's just so much going on in our lives, so busy, so much stress. That's got to affect the immune system.
Boy, people who are under lots of stress and depression, for that matter, increase their risk of cancer because it basically knocks out the immune system. In fact, in one 10-year study, they found that stress and interpersonal skills had a much higher impact on your rate of cancer than things like smoking and medical diseases and drinking. In fact, people with stress had a 40% higher death rate from cancer than people who didn't have that factor.
Interesting. And I think I've heard you mention before that when you're under stress, you release certain hormones into your body, and those hormones are what suppress the immune system. Is that correct?
Cortisol, for one, will suppress your immune system.
And it's not just stress. When I get angry, that's got to affect that too, correct?
Oh, yes. 5 minutes of anger, an angry outburst, can suppress your immune system for 5 to 6 hours.
Really?
It's a big hit on your immune system. People who suppress their anger have much higher mortality rates from cancer. Once they have the cancer, their prognosis is worse.
Well, we've talked about so much today. Can we touch a little bit on, when you're talking about DNA just going out of control? if I stand in front of my microwave, I hear that's a bad idea.
Yeah, microwave is not the only source of radiation people have in their houses, but it is a source. And we all know that the bomb that hit Hiroshima increased cancer in those that survived.
Yep, nuclear.
And yeah, nuclear bombs and anything like radioactive elements, X-rays.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I always thought it was funny how, you stand there, they ask you, are you pregnant? Or we'll put this big lead vest on you, and they always run out of the room before they click the button.
Yes.
So, makes you think, I guess they don't want it too much exposure.
Oh, that's right. They don't want cancer.
That's right. You mentioned magnetic fields.
Yeah.
If I'm talking on my cell phone, that's not enough to be a field. Would you agree? Because everyone I know has cell phones. We're always on the cell phone now.
So, when my cell phone rings, all the speakers in my house buzz.
I noticed
Have you
that.
noticed
Yes.
that? That's a huge magnetic field.
Interesting.
It's
Yep.
making your speaker buzz. And in fact, studies show that cell phones significantly increase astrocytomas in the temporal area of the brain. You might know, well, what's that? Astrocytomas, brain cancer. And the temporal area is right where you would hold your cell phone.
That's true.
And so it happens on the side you hold the cell phone, not on the other side. And there's also an increase in acoustic neuromas. That's a cancer in the inner ear. Studies on humans show that electric blanket, which produces electromagnetic field, increases breast cancer risk.
Interesting.
It increases with the number of years of use, the number of seasons of use, the length of time of use each night. And so it's definitely proportional to the amount of electromagnetic field that you are subjected to.
Breast cancer and the electromagnetic field.
Oh, yeah.
Not very good. Well, tell me a little bit more about that.
Oh, and it's not just limited to electric blankets. They did studies on women who work in electromagnetic field industries, high lines, and even women who sit in front of the old, TV-type computer monitors.
Yep.
They saw an increased risk of cancer.
Interesting.
Yeah, and for those that, decided they wanted to be line workers, work on the high lines, the risk of breast cancer went up more than doubled.
Wow.
And system analysts and programmers, the risk went up 65% from those, TV tube type monitors, CTRs. So the risk of cancer goes up when you get these magnetic fields. It's basically ionizing radiation that causes DNA damage.
Well, you said affecting women and breast cancer. What about kids? I mean, nowadays, I can't think of a kid who's not playing video games or,
yes.
just always around something that produces electromagnetic problems. Are we noticing a change in child incidence of cancer with that?
Oh, yes, and that's an interesting study. Usually the cancer that shows up in children is leukemia. It's a cancer in the blood. And it can go back even to prenatally. Before the child's born. If mother used an electric pad or blanket while she was pregnant, then the risk of cancer in a child goes up.
Interesting.
Children who use electric blankets and electric mattress pads. Hair dryers will do it. Video games and arcades, especially video games hooked to a television set where it's a big TV, that increases in studies the risk of cancers, especially leukemia in children.
Well, I had a friend who moved into an old house.
Yeah?
And they started doing lead testing on their kids.
Ooh.
And the levels had gone up.
Yes.
And I know that a lot of people now can have the choice of doing lead testing before they move into a home.
Yes.
Because they're saying now that so many metals and other things along those lines cause problems, cancer with kids.
Oh, yes. And what happens is these metals get into the person, and it increases the oxidative stress. It starts, iron, nickel, cadmium, zinc, chromium, mercury. We've known mercury for a long time. Lead.
Yep.
All are found in increased amounts in the tumors of people with cancer.
Interesting.
We think of the lead issue. Lead paint was, outlawed back, or, you couldn't put as much lead in it back in the 70s. But there's still a lot of lead around, like in these old houses, and the paint will peel off and the lead gets in the ground and the kid runs around outside and tracks the dirt inside, and of course their hands and feet are on the floor, and then they lick their hands or feet. And the lead problem, I remember hearing about somebody who decided to get this old mansion and remodel it, and when they were done, their kids were practically sick with lead.
Right.
And they had to get rid of the place, and I don't know if it ever got cleaned up. But lead is a major problem. Mercury, too, for that matter. Where do you get mercury?
Fish.
Fish, that's right.
You've mentioned so many things that really affect your DNA and disrupted DNA, leading to cancer. We've talked about viruses, toxins, oxidative stresses, radiation, and that just keeps your DNA from repairing. I mean, it seems like DNA is out of control.
Yeah, that's true. DNA gets out of control. And I guess in summarizing here, what we've been saying is there's a couple different ways to get cancer. One is if your DNA goes crazy. This can happen when a virus takes over and messes with it, when a toxin messes with it, when oxidative stress, zaps it, as we said, when radiation, ionizing radiation, changes it.
Yep.
And once it's changed, if the immune system isn't working to straighten it out, or, the DNA repair machinery is not in place, then you can end up with DNA out of control and end up with cancer. And then the other problem is once the DNA is out of control, oftentimes when you're always healing, or you have lots of inflammation, it tends to push the cancer on, or if you're getting too many hormones, then that cancer really grows fast and becomes a big problem.
So what's the answer?
Well, that's going to be the subject of another talk. I hate to put you off, but that's the second part of our cancer DVD set.
Sounds good.